when they're confronted with someone who doesn't believe in civil rights for foreign narco-terrorists who are not American citizens, the very first thing that comes to mind is not a rational argument. It's not a clever retort. Instead, they simply ask, have you read To Kill a Mockingbird? After the Pentagon blew up a boat full of drug traffickers last week, J.D. Vance immediately celebrated the bombings on social media. He wrote, quote, killing cartel members who poison our fellow citizens is the highest and best use of our military. And then when someone suggested that the White House had committed a war crime, Vance replied simply, I don't give a what you call it, which is a great response. As you can imagine, there were quite a few replies to J.D. Vance's post. The vast majority were positive. People are tired of seeing overdoses in their families and their communities. They recognize that foreign drug traffickers operating international waters aren't entitled to any due process under our Constitution. But not everybody was thrilled with Vance's reply. In particular, a fellow member of the Republican Party, Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky, unloaded on J.D. Vance. And there's a specific portion of his reply that needs to be discussed at some length. Here's what Rand Paul wrote, quote, J.D., don't give a Vance says killing people he accuses of a crime is the highest and best use of the military. Did he ever read To Kill a Mockingbird? Did he ever wonder what might happen if the accused were immediately executed without trial and representation? What a despicable and thoughtless sentiment it is to glorify killing someone without a trial. Now, if you had to classify this form of argument, you'd call it an appeal to authority or an appeal to fiction, really. And this is when, to bolster your point, you cite some established expert or legal case or study or something like that. But in this case, instead of citing anything with any substance whatsoever, Rand Paul cites To Kill a Mockingbird. And he wonders whether J.D. Vance, the Vice President of the United States, has ever read the book. That's the kill shot in Rand Paul's foreign policy argument. Now, just in case you're one of the 10 people in the country who was not forced to read this book at some point in your life, I should make it clear that To Kill a Mockingbird is a work of fiction, and it's written at a child's reading level. Middle schoolers and high schoolers are the main audience, and even children, when they're ordered to read this book, which nobody ever would have read it if not for the fact that everyone is forced to read it, but even they generally understand that it was written by some random woman who invented a story in her head. It's not a documentary. It's not a textbook on constitutional law. It's certainly not a manual for how to approach drug cartels. It's a dumb story, and not an especially well-written one either. Now, it's true that for generations, To Kill a Mockingbird has always had the full backing of every establishment institution in the country. Every school and government relentlessly pushed the book on young people as soon as it was published in 1960. It won a Pulitzer within a year of its release. A group of librarians in Britain declared that To Kill a Mockingbird was just as important as the Bible. This book was force-fed on everyone, just like that U2 album that Apple installed on everybody's phone without their permission several years ago. That doesn't mean that the book is any good. And it certainly doesn't mean that the book is relevant to a foreign policy debate with J.D. Vance. And that's why, predictably, Rand Paul's post was mocked all over the internet. Even people who like and respect Rand Paul, as I do, by the way, joined in on the fun because it was just too hard to resist. For example, here's a post showing a scene from the movie 300 with the caption, quote, disgusting. Leonidas brutally executes Xerxes' emissaries without trial. Hasn't he read To Kill a Mockingbird? And then there's this one for the Lord of the Rings fans. Quote, disgusting. Aragorn brutally executes the mouth of Sauron without trial. Has he read To Kill a Mockingbird? And then one more. I mean, I think we basically get the idea. Unbelievable. Odysseus cold-heartedly kills the suitors without trial for making sure they're, or making sure they're not mentally ill. Has he read To Kill a Mockingbird? And on and on and on. Put simply, not many people were convinced by Rand Paul's attempt at an appeal to authority. At the same time, there's an even more fundamental problem with Rand Paul's reasoning. The problem isn't simply that To Kill a Mockingbird is a work of fiction that was written for middle schoolers. I mean, by itself, that's pretty bad, obviously. But even if you accept that fact, there are some other issues here. In particular, To Kill a Mockingbird is a scam. I mean, although the story is fictional, it's based on lies. There are very relevant facts about the production of the novel and its aftermath that no one really talks about. And the reason that no one talks about these facts is that they undercut the propaganda that the book is intended to convey. And the book is propaganda, which is why they force feed it to kids. It is all part of the effort to teach kids in school that America is a racist country with a racist past and all these terrible things. And this is what you should feel guilty about. That's why that is the only reason. It's not because the book is some great, novel, some great piece of art. It is purely for that reason and no reason other than that. You know, imagine if, say, someone as famous and widely read as George R.R. Martin released a new Game of Thrones book, and then collectively everyone just agreed to ignore it because it contradicted some political narrative from a previous book he wrote. It seems hard to imagine something like that happening. The sheer popularity of the author's existing books would make it seem impossible, in fact. But that's what's happened with To Kill a Mockingbird. And before we get into that, If you've never read the book, here's just a quick plot summary, which I pulled from Wikipedia for the most part because it's been 25 years since I was forced to read it, or maybe longer. I don't even remember when exactly, but I do remember being given this infernal book. To Kill a Mockingbird takes place in Alabama during the Great Depression. A black man named Tom Robinson is accused of sexually assaulting a white woman. Atticus Finch is the white lawyer played by Gregory Peck in the movie, of course, who has to defend Tom Robinson. The whole town wants Tom to be lynched because, of course, all the white people in Alabama are racists with low IQs and no capacity to engage in any kind of independent thought whatsoever. We're led to believe that in the South, this is how pretty much everyone was and how every lynching worked and how justice worked in the South. But Atticus Finch, a man of great moral character, presents a defense. He points out, for example, that Tom Robinson's left arm had been caught in a cotton gin, leaving him with a severe physical disability. Specifically, his left arm was useless and also 12 inches shorter than his right arm. Atticus Finch, being the clever attorney that he is, used this fact to demonstrate that Tom couldn't possibly have beaten the girl since she was mostly hit on the right side of her face. Supposedly that makes some kind of sense, even though, there are ways of beating someone on the other side of the face from where your good hand is. But in any event, as the novel or Wikipedia summary continues, it emerges that the white girl had actually made sexual advances on the black man and that the white girl was beaten by her own father, meaning that there was no sexual assault of any kind committed by Tom Robinson. Yes, that's the twist. The white girl is the sexual aggressor against the black man. Bet you didn't see that coming. Unless you were a smart kid in school and you knew that, well, like every book that deals with race, if we're reading it in school, the white person is always going to be the villain. Every single one, every single book. So if you were a smart kid in school, you would have picked up on that. This month, one of the biggest prayer challenges on Hallow is back, Saints in 7 days. Here's the point. The saints aren't fairy tales. They're not faceless figures in stained glass. They're real people, flawed, messy, sinful, and yet God worked through them in powerful, surprising ways. Starting September 15th, they begin with King David, led by Michael Iskander, who portrays David in the series House of David. Shepherd boy, warrior, king, poet. He faced temptation, failure, grave sin as well, but he always came back to God. His psalms are brutally honest, joyful, repentant, trustful, all these things. Then on September 22nd, Gwen Stefani walks us through Esther, a young queen who could have stayed quiet. Instead, she risked everything, stood up to power, and saved her people. We also hear from St. Therese, who reminds us that holiness isn't about big, flashy deeds, but small acts of love. And from St. Oscar Romero, who literally gave his life for truth and justice. The point is simple. Holiness doesn't look the same for everyone, but God calls each of us. Saints in 7 days starts September 15th on Hallow. Don't miss it. Download Hallow for 3 months free at hallow.com/Matt Walsh. But they were certainly surprised back in the 1960s when they read this. But then, despite that fact, the jury still convicts Tom Robinson anyway, and that's how racist white people are, as we all know. And then for good measure, the white people kill Tom Robinson at the end. Supposedly he was escaping, but honestly, they probably just shot him because he's black. And that's the gist. So, really, really bad white people doing really bad white people stuff. That's the book. That's what the book's about. Again, pretty much everyone's familiar with the broad outline. As a child, you probably, at least pulled up the Spark Notes. What you're probably not familiar with, by contrast, is the backstory for how Harper Lee, the author of To Kill a Mockingbird, came up with this plot. And it turns out that in real life, Harper Lee's father was an attorney named A.C. Lee, and he mostly handled contractual disputes, wills, estates, that kind of thing. Wasn't exactly a big trial attorney, but in December of 1919, several years before Harper Lee was born, A.C. Lee took on a criminal case. This was the first and last criminal case that he would ever handle. Here's a newspaper clipping describing the facts of the alleged crime. Quote, aged Confederate veteran is killed in Monroe County. 4 Negroes charged with murder of Bill Northrup. That's the headline. And the article begins, news reached here today of the murder of Billy Northrup, an elderly farmer and storekeeper living 6 miles from Lower Peachtree. Now, back in the early 20th century, it wasn't particularly uncommon for inexperienced white attorneys to take on cases like this. No one else really wanted to do it, so that's what A.C. Lee did, even though the facts were pretty dire from a legal perspective. The article continues, quote, What is thought to be bloodstains are visible on the overalls worn by Brown Ezel. Mr. Northrup had only one arm and is believed he leaned down to get merchandise from under the counter. He was struck over the head and shoulders with a piece of scantling with such force as to fracture the skull and shoulder. This occurrence on Friday night. Over $150 is thought to have been stolen. $70 were recovered by one of the captured Negroes, and it is said that they had been spending money freely. So the elderly white store owner with only one functioning arm is beaten to death in his own store, and the police later found bloodstains on overalls worn by a black man named Brown Ezel, the father of Frank Ezel, who was also arrested for the murder. So if this is all sounding familiar, in To Kill a Mockingbird, the black suspect, Tom Robinson, only has one functioning arm. That's a key piece of evidence that's supposed to convince the audience that he's a really sympathetic and innocent figure in the case. But in real life, the black suspects brutally murdered a white guy who had only one functioning arm. So in other words, Harper Lee was inspired by true events, which, you might have heard about that in school, except she was inspired to completely invert these true events and make it so that the sympathetic person with one functioning arm wasn't the white victim who was murdered, but instead was the black suspect. It's a bit like writing a book based on the moon landing, except the entire mission control team at NASA is a bunch of DEI hires, which actually sounds familiar with some movies that have been made. But things get even worse for To Kill a Mockingbird when you realize that the younger suspect confessed his role in the murder just before he was hanged. So and that was back when they used to, hang criminals. So we're not exactly talking about a frame job here. This was not a case where Harper Lee's dad did anything heroic or impressive. He took on a criminal case for the first time in his life. He lost. His client confessed and was executed, and that's what actually happened in Alabama when Harper Lee's father decided to take on a criminal case involving black defendants. But of course, if Harper Lee had written that story, that actual story, she would not have won the Pulitzer, and no child would have been forced to read her book. In fact, they probably would have, burned her book and made it a hate crime to read it. I mean, the book would have been banned from schools, not made into mandated reading. Now, you probably didn't know any of this. It's not part of the mythology of the book that's taught to students in middle school. It's not part of the mythology of American history, of the South. Part of that mythology where every single white person in the South were a bunch of racist bigots and horrible people, and they were just killing black people randomly all the time. Neither is the fact that Harper Lee actually wrote a sequel of sorts many years after the publication of To Kill a Mockingbird. The sequel, which maybe you heard of, is called Go Set a Watchman. And really, Go Set a Watchman began as an early draft of To Kill a Mockingbird, but it was released after the fact by Harper Lee in 2015, just a year before she died. And in that book, Atticus Finch is not portrayed as some noble crusader who bravely wages war against all the Southern racists. Instead, very early on in the novel, Atticus is discovered in possession of a pamphlet called The Black Plague, and he attends white supremacist meetings and introduces racist speakers. He tells his daughter that blacks in the South aren't ready for civil rights, which is a direct quote from the book. Quote, "Do you want your children going to a school that's been dragged down to accommodate Negro children?" Atticus also says, quote, "What would happen if all the Negroes in the South were suddenly given full civil rights? I'll tell you, there'd be another Reconstruction. Would you want your state government run by people who don't know how to run them? Negroes down here are still in their childhood as a people. They've made terrific progress in adapting themselves to white ways, but they're far from it yet." And it goes on from there. Quote, "All the Democratic Party has to do with Jefferson these days is put his picture up at banquets. Jefferson believed full citizenship was a privilege to be earned by each man, that it was not something given lightly nor to be taken lightly. A man couldn't vote simply because he was a man. In Jefferson's eyes, he had to be a responsible man. I'd like very much to be left alone to manage my own affairs in a live and let live economy. I'd like for my state to be left alone to keep house without advice from the NAACP, which knows next to nothing about its business and cares less." So this is not exactly Gregory Peck's version of Atticus Finch. This isn't the version you were forced to read in middle school. He's a guy who rages against the Supreme Court for outlawing segregation, hates the NAACP, and thinks the civil rights movement is a fraud. And then towards the end of the novel, when Atticus's daughter freaks out and says she wants to drive away from home, saying this isn't the same Atticus Finch that she thought she knew, her Uncle Jack slaps her across the face, and he tells her that she needs to start facing reality. Quote, "You have a tendency not to give anybody elbow room in your mind for their ideas, no matter how silly you think they are." That's the message of the sequel of To Kill a Mockingbird, which again is more like a first draft of that book. So to put it mildly, should be a pretty clear sign why no school assigns this book for children to read. It's also pretty clear why when Go Set a Watchman was released, various news outlets wrote articles about how terrible it was and how it never should have been published because it destroys Harper Lee's so-called legacy or whatever. Now, did you know about any of this? Was Rand Paul familiar with the backstory here? Probably not. And if we're being honest, that's probably the most interesting part of To Kill a Mockingbird. All historic context surrounding the book, from its origin story to its sequel, has been memory hold. Just read To Kill a Mockingbird, children are told. It contains important life lessons, supposedly. And then when some of those children go on to become U.S. senators, they repeat the mantra. When they're confronted with someone who doesn't believe in civil rights for foreign narco-terrorists who are not American citizens, the very first thing that comes to mind is not a rational argument. It's not a clever retort. Instead, they simply ask, as Rand Paul did, have you read To Kill a Mockingbird? As if that should end the entire debate. The better question for people like Rand Paul is, have you read Go Set a Watchman? Or did you skip that particular children's book? And if so, please stop citing the prequel when the sequel is available. I mean, there's a whole backstory within the Harper Lee metaverse that you really need to explore immediately. It'll change your whole perspective, believe me. Give Rand Paul a copy of Go Set a Watchman. Who knows? He might start calling for nuclear bombs to be dropped on drug cartels overnight. As long as we're letting Harper Lee control our foreign policy from beyond the grave, I mean, anything's possible. Of course, for everyone else, people who prefer to address facts as they exist in the real world instead of children's literature from the 1960s, really neither book is worth reading, and none of this matters. In particular, To Kill a Mockingbird is not based in reality. It's not an accurate reflection of life in Alabama during the Great Depression. It's not even an accurate reflection of what Harper Lee's father experienced during the Great Depression. It is instead a very heavily promoted piece of racial propaganda, one that's intended, as with every other piece of racial propaganda promoted by our establishment, to demonize white people and portray black criminals as sympathetic victims of circumstance. To Kill a Mockingbird is a poorly written book whose history has been sanitized relentlessly in order to continue promoting that narrative. And that is why To Kill a Mockingbird, a book that you've almost certainly been forced to read at one point in your life, is today, very belatedly, canceled. If you'd like to see what else I have to say, you can access my full show by going to dailywire.com or by going to the Matt Walsh Show Twitter page. Hope to see you there. Godspeed.